Hello. Today we're going to talk about women's rights movement. I first thought that I would hang on to that and wait and talk about it in a much later video. But I feel that it's so basic for women's history. The women's rights movements have been such a big part in creating the society we have today and our way of living today. So instead of using the phrase women's rights movement, I will use the word feminism. That's a word that is a bit problematic to use. For instance, we have Twitter accounts like Everyday Sexism that talk about and show us how everyday little comments on women's lives and choices and things like that and looks. We think that if we just hear one, it's just a little comment. Maybe it's just a joke. It's no big deal. But when you see them all together, you see that they are not just a little joke. It's a part of a larger structure that people obviously think that it is as it should to talk to women the way women are being talked to. If you don't know what I talk about, go to Twitter and follow the Everyday Sexism account for a couple of days. You will notice, you will realize what's happening. But since we talk about sexism, and feminism is kind of a counterpart on that, so that's why it's a bit difficult to use the word feminism in the historical content, but I will do that anyway because it's less syllables. It's a bit long to say women's rights movement. Eventually we started using the word feminism even for that. So we talk about feminism as coming in three waves throughout history. The first wave started in the mid-1800s, and yes, there have been people talking about women's rights even since as early as the 1600s. But when it's just one person here and one person there, you can't really talk about a movement then. To start with, they worked for women to get basic democratic rights. For instance, that they would be allowed to decide things for themselves, that they would be allowed to sign contracts, that they would have the right to inherit their parents. They also wanted the right to educate themselves and the right to run businesses. There could be a way for women to run a business, and that was if she was a widow. If she and her husband together had a business running and he died, she could be allowed to continue with that business. But that was for widows, and in most societies people wanted the widows to remarry because it was a bit inconvenient for people, to have women walking around deciding for themselves. Couldn't have it like that, could we? But most of all, the first wave's feminism was about suffrage, women's right to vote. But it was a bit difficult because there were a lot of people that weren't allowed to vote. It was not just women. In Sweden, you had to earn a certain amount of money before you were allowed to vote, even as a man. And there have been different rules like that all over the Western world. And in America, of course, there were also slaves and ex-slaves, and it was quite a big deal for them to start to get to vote as well. All throughout the 1800s, this first wave feminism is growing and it's moving. It's really strong in America. It's growing fast there, but it's also growing very fast in the UK and throughout all of Europe, actually. The first country to give women suffrage. Can you guess which country it was? Did you guess? I would guess you were wrong. It was New Zealand! Yes, in 1893. So as soon as 1893, New Zealandians, women in New Zealand were allowed to vote. In 1907 was the first year when a woman in a Western country could be elected into the parliament. That was another fight, obviously, but it's also in the first wave feminism. Which country? Finland! Good job there. In the 1920s, most countries in the Western world had given women the right to vote. And with that, we end the first wave feminism. The second wave feminism started in the 1960s. This wave was more about the culture, about how we look at women and how we value women, and that women should have the right to make all the decisions of their own life and of their bodies. Earlier, it was like a duty for a woman to give birth to children. This thing where the woman should have the right to decide whether she wanted to give birth to children or not. And also the right for a woman to really, really enjoy sex, That's also a part of this. Basic respect for the value of women as men's equals. They also wanted to have the possibility to get the same jobs. And they also started to protest about women being paid so much less than men for the same job. And that is a struggle we still haven't won. The second wave ended in the early 1980s, we can say. The third wave of feminism started in the 1990s. And this third wave was about getting women into positions of power, into politics and into corporation, boards of corporations and things like that. There are still mostly men in politics. It's a bit different from country to country, of course. If you, for instance, see pictures from EU meetings and things like that, you can see that it's quite different from country to country, whether there are mostly men or if there are about the same amount of men and women. The second thing about the third wave is that we started to spread the issues, because up until now, up until the 90s, it had mostly been white upper middle class women that had been demanding the suffrage and the equal rights and the right to their bodies and things like that. With this third wave feminism, they started to spread their word outside that circle, so to different parts of the world and different parts of the society, that even a homeless woman should have right to her own body. We shouldn't just accept that she is getting raped, for instance. We also have in some countries where they mutilate the reproductive parts. They call it female circumcision, but of course it's not circumcision. To do that to a girl, it's terrible, and that's also one thing that they started fighting for. And there are people now that are talking about that we might be in a fourth wave right now. The world is a bit different than in the 1990s when the third wave started, because we do now have all the social media, for instance. I daily see discussions about this on Facebook, and I see articles being spread, and what we see with this is, for the first time, the men are really invested in this as well. There have always been men in this, but now we see them more clearly and they speak more loudly. Men that have never seen themselves as sexist, or they have just done those little comments and the things that I talked about earlier. They now see that even their little comments and even their way of talking to women have been a part of a bigger structure. But whether we are in a fourth wave or not is not up to us to decide, because it's up to the historians of the future to decide when one thing ends and another one starts. That was the 3 or possibly 4 waves of feminism. I think I will make a more detailed video on each one of them, at least the first 3 ones. So I hope you learned something new. And I also hope to see you soon. Bye!